Welcome to the Center for American Progress. Thank you for joining us for today's event. We'd like to ask you to please silence your mobile devices. If you've brought a laptop or a tablet, please mute notifications or put these items in Do Not Disturb. When our question and answer period begins, please raise your hand and a microphone will be brought to you. Remember to state your name and affiliation. Please, one question per guest. Thank you again for being present. The event will start soon.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming today. It's a very special event, the Forgotten War, Sudan in Crisis. My name is Anne Maria Griffin, and I'm Senior Fellow focusing on Africa policy here at CAP, and just excited about today. CAP has recently, under the guidance of our esteemed CEO, former Ambassador Gaspard, energized and raised the profile of our Africa work, which I am honored to lead. Today's event, we hope, will be emblematic of our goals in terms of Africa policy. We hope to do three things. One, draw attention to the areas of the world that are often neglected and forgotten and overlooked. Two, encourage and promote policy change and advocacy to improve the conditions of populations and foster economic growth, a just energy transition, and peace and justice. And three, revitalize and energize our respect, the involvement of the African community, of those who have African descent. That's really important to us because through that respect for and partnership with African diaspora, we together can promote policy change. So CAP will continue to do just this as we recognize the power of the more than 50 million members of the African diaspora who express an affinity with the continent and who live in the United States. So thank you for joining us today to move us substantially closer to our aims for our Africa work, particularly as we dedicate our gathering to the needs of the Sudanese people. I personally don't feel comfortable with the title Forgotten War because as a part of the older generation who learned to speak truth to power back in the old days of Trans-Africa and the anti-apartheid movement, those days of struggle, I instead prefer to view these crises through the perspective of those who experience these realities firsthand. In this case, these experiences, as many of you saw from the New York Times article, and you'll hear from the panelists today, can never be forgotten. They can never be invisible. How can we talk about the crisis in Sudan as such, with narratives that indicate so many traumatic, jolting truths? An example is the statistics that show that Sudan is experiencing the largest population displacement in the world. So today's session is about how we can all contribute toward building the constituency that can address this crisis. We've come here to set the platform with critical conversations with government and civil society, and to strategize about our respective roles together and apart to foster the transformation of a continent and embolden a constructive path forward for and with the people of Sudan. Patrick Gaspard will come forward to introduce and then moderate the panel, which I'm sure will be quite a dynamic session. But first, I want to call on a special guest to begin our discussion, Ampital Mahmoud. She's a renowned Sudanese American poet and author, Goodwill Ambassador with UNHCR, and was named one of BBC's 100 most inspirational women. She's a TED speaker, a humanitarian, and peace activist who dedicates her time to fostering and facilitating the inclusion of marginalized voices into the private sector, the public sector, and the media. She is truly a phenomenal representative of the younger generation of Sudanese activists. Emmy, would you please come to the podium?
Hello, everyone. I'm going to dive right in. Hello. With a poem. Can you hear me? It's about where I'm from. Memories of my childhood live between the rings of sand around my ankles and the desert heat in my lungs. I still believe that nothing washes worry from tired skin better than the Nile and my grandma's hands. Every day I go to school with the weight of dead neighbors on my shoulders. The first time I saw bomb smoke, it didn't wind and billow like the heat from the kitchen hearth, but it forced itself on the Darfur sky, smothering the sun with tears that it stole from our bodies. The worst thing about genocide isn't the hunger, the murder, the politics, the government-paid soldiers that chase you across borders and into camps. It's the silence. For 3 months, they closed the schools down because people like us are an eyesore. So the first month we took it. The second, we waited. The third month, we met underneath the date palm trees. Every second, our teachers gave us turning fruit pits into fractions. On the last day, they came with a message, put them in their place. We didn't stand a chance. Flesh was never meant to dance with silver bullets, so we prayed for the sun to come and melt daggers from our backs, lifted our voices up to God till the clouds were spent for weeping in the sand. Beneath our toes, echoed with the song of every soul that ever walked before us. I hid underneath the bed that day with 4 other people. 12 years later, and I can't help but wonder where my cousins hid when the soldiers torched the houses, to the bodies in the wells, so if the weapons didn't get you, the poison would, and sometimes they didn't want to use bullets because it would cost them more than we did. But what does it matter? I've seen 16 ways to stop a heart when you build nations on someone's bones. What sense does it make to break them? In one day, while they choked on rifle smoke, my father washed the blood from his face. My uncles carried half the bodies to the hospital and the rest to the grave, and we watched. For every funeral we planned, there were 60. We couldn't have the sand in the Sahara taste a lot like powdered bone. And when the soldiers came, our blood on their ankles, I remember their laces, scarlet footprints on the floor. I remember waking to the sound of hushed voices in the night, etched with the kind of sorrow that turns even the loudest dreams to ash. Our parents came home with broken collarbones and a taste of fear carved into their skin, and it was impossible to believe in anything. Fear is the coldest thing in the desert, and it burns you, bows you down to half your height and owns you, and no one hears you. Because what could grow in the desert? Anyway, thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much. Oh, sorry, you're finished. Thank you. That's so sweet. You're so sweet. Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone. Very flustered. Well, as you heard, my name is Imtithal Mahmoud. I'm a Goodwill Ambassador for UNHCR, the UN Refugee Agency. I'm an Indigenous African former refugee from Sudan and Philadelphia. I'm a world champion poet and a scientist, but today I come to you as a humanitarian first and foremost. In the past year, I've lost 11 family members, 4 of them in the past several weeks. There's no words to describe this pain, but I'm not alone and I'm not unique. For the past year, this has been Sudan's reality. And now, as you've heard, it comprises the largest displacement crisis of our time. 1.8 million out of the country, 8.8 million displaced overall. And among them are my family members. And among them are the family of those here in the room. What I need you to understand about Sudan's reality is that the urgency is never captured by how it's spoken about, if it's at all spoken about at all. More than 15,000 people have been killed. 230,000 children and pregnant mothers are at risk of dying in the next coming months from famine, the risk of famine. Women and girls have been repeatedly subjected to rape as a weapon of war. And in one of the internally displaced person camps in Darfur, specifically where I'm from, where my family lives, in Zamzam camp, it's reported that a child dies every 2 hours. But just as all of this was happening, for those of us in the diaspora, the silence has been deafening. So we took it upon ourselves to do all we can to shift the tide, but we can't do it alone. Just as war can be a destabilizing force, peace too can be a stabilizing force. And that's why we need all of you, all voices, all hands on deck. Sudan does not exist in a vacuum. It is a part of this world. And we are tired of going unnoticed or unheard. How can we make these changes? We need to build a sustainable peace that is inclusive, with civilians included on every single level and every step of the process. You cannot support the Sudanese people without the Sudanese people, and that is the bottom line. And that's what this last poem is dedicated to, and I hope it inspires you to lead with your humanity. Because one of my favorite quotes is that there are no humanitarian solutions to humanitarian problems, because they're not caused by our humanity. They're caused by so many other things. When the late Commissioner Ogata said this, what she meant was not that there's no hope. She meant that there are no humanitarian solutions because they're not caused by our humanity. There are state solutions, there are political solutions, there are financial solutions. And that's why we all need to collaborate together. We have been reaching our hand out for over a year, maybe longer. And I'm so glad you're reaching out to hold it back. This poem is called Sudan Baladi, which means Sudan, my home. And it draws attention. And I hope it inspires you to lead with your humanity. Another war came crashing down on our bodies. The cut of a broken piece and the bite of a broken promise are the same, except with the first one, death follows and takes everyone around you. Back home, our skin is green because we're full of life. A full life looks so different when it's poured out onto the rubble, rotting in the streets. Every university became a grave, every garden a final resting place. Our brothers and sisters fall faster than we can dig the holes. Bloodlines burn, singed to ash, to soil, to sand, to nothing, to dust. On the receiving end of a bullet is a little girl, a brother, a family, a mother, a home. Airstrikes Zahoy, Dana, airstrikes Zahoy, Dana. Blood on the streets of Khartoum and Al-Ubaid. Blood in the wadis of Niyala and Ajnana. In the mountains of Al-Fashir, the pyramids of Marawi. Blood across the skies of our beautiful country, Sudan, Baladi. Who did this to you, my love? Who stripped you bare and turned all your children loose? The bodies fall, they don't stop, the killing starts, we don't run, hoping against hope that it's a mistake, that if we sit quiet and still enough, maybe it'll stop, that if our hearts beat loudly enough, they'll know that we're human, that we bleed the same blood, that we bleed the same blood. Who decides who lives or dies? My uncle Abdul Aziz walked home from prayer. The bomb rolled down from above, killed him and 4 neighbors, took them away from us. Sunrise saw my cousin Ammar on the way to college, my uncle Ibrahim resting at home. Each found a bullet, each found an end. My uncle Ibrahim Ahmed lost his life when the hospital shuttered, became more dangerous than disease that robbed him. I held my mother as we cried for her brother, for all of our people across Sudan. One on the first day, one on the next, another soon after. The next day comes and there's nowhere to run. My country falls to pieces and my people go missing one by one. We broke fast together one night and planned burials together by morning. Roads covered, rubble still bleeding, sent to the bottom of a crater, reduced to a footnote in a world said to be in crisis. First orphans, now refugees. For the first time, the second or the third, home is burning. See the buildings falling, see the fire flashing, hear the people evaporating before our eyes. The hospitals filled with the wounded and our lungs filled with ash. Then the hospitals shuttered and the borders too. And the headlines named our killers, but not us. And the world keeps moving. And the people whisper it's a mystery, and their names turn to memories in our mouths. Their names turn to memories in our mouths. A country without its people, a people robbed of time. How can I explain what it's like to sleep and not wake up, or to wake up and know that it happened again, and you are oceans away, crying, pleading, screaming for our voices to be heard, dying for our lives, literally dying for our lives. In my country, wars have ended, but peace has never come. Who bought the bullets? Who sold the guns? Who pulled the trigger? Who will bring the peace? Who will stop the war? Who decides who lives or dies? Tell me how to make it stop. Tell me how to make it stop. Sudan, Baladi, who did this to you, my love? My country, can you hear me? My country, can you hear me?
Can we get another round of applause for Emmy, please? Please. You know, two months ago, when we started having conversations about standing up a conversation about the crisis in Sudan, I spoke to my good friend Tom Perriello, who's the special envoy to Sudan, now appointed by President Biden. And first thing he said to me was, I just met a prophet, and we have to have that prophet open up the event. He was, of course, talking about you. And Tom is not given to hyperbole. If anything, he understated the power of your words and the power of your conviction. I can promise you, in your poem, you said that your people have been reduced to a footnote. I can promise you that every day, starting today, we're going to lift them up and foreground them in all of our policy work. So thank you so very much. As has been said here, Sudan has been engulfed in civil war since fighting erupted on April 15th of last year. This conflict is between the Sudanese armed forces and a paramilitary group known as the Rapid Support Forces. As Emmy noted, this conflict has created the largest crisis of displaced people in the world, 8.5 million displaced people, 3/4 of whom are women and girls, and millions more at risk of famine. Infrastructure has been completely ravaged. In conflict areas, more than 70% of healthcare facilities have been closed. Clean water and sufficient food are increasingly hard to come by. While the United States and international partners are sending humanitarian aid into Sudan, this crisis continues to deepen, continues to indeed worsen. This must be addressed urgently and must be addressed strategically. As somebody who accompanied the activism of women and students and courageous civil society leaders on the streets of Khartoum in 2019 as they worked boldly to oust Omar al-Bashir, it's pained me to see the violent dissolution of the transitional civilian government in Sudan. It's been more painful to see this active civil war now. But to be honest with you, it's been most acutely painful to experience the indifference of much of the world. 2 decades ago, in the midst of the genocidal crisis in Darfur, when it reached its apex, so many of us took to the streets to demand interventions, which proved to be life-saving. This time, the silence has been overwhelming, and I'd go so far as to say it's been shameful. Today, I'll be joined by leaders who always push boldly into the silent and dark spaces with enduring light. A brilliant panel that will work through solutions to this acute crisis. Senator Cory Booker, my dear friend, has been a leading advocate for the Sudan in the Senate, where he sits on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and chairs their subcommittee on Africa and global health policy. He visited Sudanese refugees in the region, I think in Chad, as part of a delegation in March, and his continued attention to work to end this crisis is nothing short of inspiring. Haitham El-Noor is a Sudanese American human rights advocate who has long been at the forefront of peace efforts in Sudan. He has led nonviolent resistant committees, advocacy campaigns, and youth anti-war movements. He studied at George Mason University and currently works at the National Institutes of Health in Bethesda. We're really quite honored to have you join us here today. Representative Pramila Jayapal, who chairs the Progressive Caucus in Congress and works very, very closely with us at CAP on innumerable issues, has been an outspoken advocate for Sudan in the U.S. House of Representatives, where she has tirelessly lifted up the importance of protecting human rights and ensuring the safe and effective delivery of humanitarian aid. Congresswoman, your consistency is appreciated and cherished. You don't cherry pick your humanitarian interventions, your human rights interventions. You lift up your voice in all of these challenging places. It's really quite profound, and it's become invaluable and indeed necessary. And last but not least, my dear friend Tom Perriello, my brother in the trenches, United States Special Envoy for the Sudan. Tom was appointed not that long ago by President Biden to serve as the envoy. He served in the U.S. House of Representatives in Virginia. He led the State Department's second quadrennial diplomacy and development review, and he served as President Obama's special envoy to Africa's Great Lakes and the Congo, where I happen to be born. He's also the former president of CAP's Action Fund. So, Tom, we welcome you back into the house that you helped to build. Tom's made meaningful progress in just the past few months. He's not with us physically. He's joining us remotely because he's engaged in ongoing negotiations in the region. He's helped us to ratchet up U.S. humanitarian aid and has helped to elevate the awareness. But as he would say, it is not elevated nearly enough. So I'm going to ask all of these panelists to join us here and we'll start this conversation. So there's so much ground to cover, but I think that we need to just start with the broad question for each of you. I'm not even gonna frame the question myself. I'm gonna rely on Emmy's poem, where she says, "In my country, wars have ended, but peace has never come. Who pulled the trigger? Who bought the bullets? Who sold the guns?" I'm gonna ask each of you, starting with our special envoy, Tom Perriello, to give us your best sense of how we arrived here in this moment in Sudan from your perspective. I will ask you not to begin to offer your solutions because we have plenty of time to do that, but let's ground the audience in person, audience remotely, the journalists who are dialing in, let's ground them in the parameters of what we're facing in Sudan. Tom, good to see you.
Thank you so much, Ambassador, for this event. Thank you for continuing to amplify and shine a light on this important crisis. And thank you to the Senator, Congresswoman, and many others for raising awareness. Let's start with the near term. It is an answer there. You can go back years or decades. But when it comes to, for example, the famine, it's important to remember there was no drought. There was no tornado that hit. There was not a disease that hit crops to create this famine. It was entirely created by men. It was a decision by two leaders of two fighting forces to fight 13 months ago. It was a decision by the RSF to burn harvests and loot all the storehouses. And it was a decision of the army to then shut down humanitarian aid when people were at their most fragile. Those are choices that humans made. In the same way, the international community has made choices not to do enough to put pressure on either side for access, not enough pressure to get food and medicine through. The war itself is a war over power between two fighting forces who themselves joined in robbing the people of the dream of inclusive democracy just a few years ago. But it is a temporary theft because we know ultimately the aspirations of the Sudanese people will win out. But there was a path to a constitutional transition. It was a path that was paved through the courage of young people and women demanding a better future. And that was a path that was destroyed, at least temporarily, by the decision of both the army and the militias to do a coup, to take that democratic path away, and eventually to fight between themselves over who would abuse the Sudanese people more. And it's on all of us to make sure that we stand with the Sudanese people to end that suffering and to hand back the aspirations that they deserve. With that, I'll close for now.
Senator, as you respond to the same question, I'll ask you to just kind of pull back and telescope from the perspective of somebody who sits on Senate Foreign Relations, who has attended to this issue for a really, really long time. Give me your overall perspective of how we arrived here in this moment of challenge, given the extraordinary investments that the U.S. and many others made way back 20 years ago to try to establish an enduring and lasting peace in Sudan.
Well, I first of all, thank you for hosting this. I think it addresses perhaps one of the most significant problems we have right now, which is a lack of attention and focus. And the fact that CAP is centering the continent of Africa, which is the future. 1 out of every 4 living humans and by 2050 will be on the continent of Africa. And given the age issues that Europe faces, China faces, America faces, 1 out of every 3 working age people will be from the African continent around that time. This is a continent that holds so much hope and so much promise and so much possibility. I want to thank Tom. He's an extraordinary leader, an extraordinary time. I don't want to repeat what he's saying, but I will, to your question, emphasize that one of the real sources of this crisis, as was reflected in the brilliant poetry we heard earlier, is the fact that the Sudanese people have not been allowed to govern. This has not been the democracy, the hope of democracy, the promise of democracy, and frankly, the stability that becomes through democracy never took hold. I love again the words of the poet, but I will say a simple saying that we've said here in the African diaspora in America: it can't be about us without us. And that has been lacking when it comes to governance. And now you have these 2 men in a fight for power. But the second point I want to make that Tom in his extraordinary sort of framing, one thing I want to add to that is this conflict would not be so agonizingly virulent without the influx of arms and resources from outside actors. This is not simply a conflict between the SAF and the RSF. It is a conflict that has brought in other regional and world powers, from Russia to Arab nations, who are in many ways part of the problem and now must be, and I know we'll get to this soon, must be a part of the solutions. Those 2 issues to me, one is the urgency of the Sudanese people determining their own future, not to warring factions fighting for power, and the urgency for the international community to create the possibilities for peace as opposed to doubling down on the destruction.
Senator, I'm going to come back to you shortly to ask you about the experiences that you had on the ground in Chad when you were meeting with Sudanese refugees and taking up their perspective and their advocacy here in this room. But Congresswoman, there are 2 words that the senator used a moment ago that often are in tension in our diplomacy and our foreign policy. The words are democracy and stability. There have been times when Too often, stability is given primacy over democracy in our diplomacy, and I think that leads to long-term instability and challenges. And I wonder, as you think about the specific challenge in Sudan and how we arrived here, how you try to reconcile those two concepts in your work and your advocacy, particularly given how fearless you have been in speaking up about what's happening to women and girls in this conflict, and candidly, the challenges that women and girls have had that predate the shooting in April of 23.
Well, thank you, Patrick, so much for your leadership and for your fearless advocacy on so many issues, including Africa and specifically Sudan. And it's great to be here with the senator and to know that we have that leadership in the Senate. And of course, to have our special envoy, who I think is looking at this very differently in terms of how we come to the ultimate solution. To answer your question and to sort of take Emmy's words and just flip them a little bit, who didn't bring the bullets? You asked who brought the bullets. Who didn't bring the bullets? Because I saw in 2019 the remarkable, absolutely remarkable, inspiring, courageous work of primarily women, Sudanese women, on the ground fighting a nonviolent resistance movement and overthrowing a dictator without bullets, and with tremendous loss of life. And I think we all watched that. I know I did, and was so deeply moved by the fact that there were a lot of bullets flying around. But in the end, it was the people who did not bring the bullets and who were sitting and refused to move and ultimately overthrew a dictator that provided the space for hope. And I was able to visit Sudan in January of 2020 with Congresswoman Karen Bass, who was the chair of the Africa subcommittee and a dear friend. She knew of my longtime interest in Sudan in particular. And to see and to meet with the people who were part of that nonviolent resistance movement and who were trying to show a different way of bringing about democracy and stability. Those two things combined can only happen if you have the people who are directly affected at the table to craft the solutions. They were certainly part of putting out a vision. They were certainly part of stopping the dictatorship, but where it fell through was in terms of what the ultimate solution, I would say, veered towards the idea of stability, but didn't actually include the aspirations and the voices of the people being in control of the process. And so we, I know when we were there, we were at university campuses, we were in small villages, we met with women and girls who talked about what they had given up in order to participate in that nonviolent resistance movement and what their hopes were. But also what their fears were, because I think part of the history of war and conflict is that often it is the very people who are affected by it that are left out. And so my hope is that this process going forward, and I know we're going to get to this, is about how we reinvigorate and give space and sight and voice to the community that is really going to live in this place going forward, and who has obviously a diaspora around the world. But I'm looking forward to that because my work in organizing is such that I think that's the only way you actually achieve both stability and democracy. One without the other is probably not lasting permanent peace.
Thank you so much, Congresswoman. So Haitham, I think that the Congresswoman gave you a perfect segue when she talked about the reinvigoration of civil society in Sudan, the active engagement of the diaspora. I have to tell you that I'm bewildered by all of this. I spent countless hours. I was privileged to spend countless hours with Dr. Hamdok when he became the leader of, before and during the period when he became the leader of the civilian transitional government. There was so much promise, so much hope, so much expectation in that first instance, but even greater hope when some of us were engaged with folks like you, the students, the doctors, the women who were at the gates of power, pushing the autocrat out. 20 years ago, when we all experienced the initial crisis in Darfur, it was categorized as the first genocide of the 21st century. All of us were determined that this would not be repeated again, but we see history repeating itself in the exact same place and seemingly in the exact same way. From the perspective of someone of that Sudanese civil society who was on the ground then, how did we arrive here? After you answer that question, I'm going to turn to the senator and I'm going to ask him to speak about the experiences that he had with Sudanese refugees displaced in Chad. And then I'm going to turn to Tom and challenge Tom on this question of the flow of munitions into Sudan and what we can begin to do to solve for that.
All right. First of all, thank you. And I had my speech written and my remarks written, but Amy is just delivered a masterpiece that I felt like it's not needed. But
We got to turn up the volume on.
Okay. Can you? Is it clear now? All right. So thanks, Amy, for making me have a plan B for my remarks. But that was a masterpiece. First, I would like to take the moment to remember all the souls that we lost in this senseless war, and may they rest in eternal peace. To the brave men and women trapped in Sudan right now in this senseless war, to the displaced people in neighboring countries, in South Sudan and in neighboring countries, your struggle is not in vain. We will do everything that we can to make your voice heard. Second, I would like to extend my heartfelt thanks to Senator Booker and Congresswoman Geopolitical for their dedicated engagement in addressing the humanitarian crisis and the ongoing conflict in Sudan. Your commitment to the crisis is deeply appreciated and crucial to our effort to bring peace and aid to Sudanese people. Thank you for your leadership and support. Third, I would like to express my sincere gratitude to the Center of American Progress for providing its platform to address the humanitarian crisis in Sudan. Your support and commitment to the crisis and raising awareness is crucial and invaluable. Thank you for your leadership and dedication. And I also would like to thank the President's Special Envoy to Sudan, whom I consider a true friend. I've seen him in action, flying all over the region, meeting with main stakeholders, with civil society, with youth, listening to them, and helping and supporting the emergency response rooms very, very generously. Thank you for that. And to answer, I think it's Sudan is been for the past at least 40 years it's been in just a chaotic scene from 1989 when the Islamists toppled and overthrown the duly elected government, and for moving forward. And I think it's just a very complex in the fact that people like tried everything with Sudan, sanctions and all the international community pressure, but one thing happened. And I think this should be the core of our conversation today, or at least from my side, is youth of Sudan decided, we're going to end this. And they end up toppling al-Bashir in the great 2018 revolution that the world saw, and it was a model for other countries. And what happened next is just the deep state or the regime, or you can call them the previous regime of al-Bashir, decided that to rip that away from the people. And I think it's, to be very specific of what happened, is the unaddressed impunity of the previous regime that led us to this situation right now. And they saw all the obstacles. They decided to just dismantle any democracy, hope for Sudanese people. And that's how we got here now.
I have so many more questions for you, and I'm going to return to you in a moment, but I want to turn to the senator first. Senator, you were on the ground, you met with Sudanese refugees, and you came back and you testified in front of your colleagues on the Foreign Relations Committee, and you talked about the poverty in the region, but you also talked about the poverty of inaction, the poverty of empathy. I want you to recount for our audience your experiences with those refugees and how that experience is now informing the set of actions that you believe the U.S. government, in partnership with the international community, must take up urgently now. You wrote a letter with members of Congress that specified a set of actions that you think are urgently needed. I hope you'll walk us through all of that.
I think the most important thing is to understand the true gravity of this crisis in terms of just the sheer enormity of suffering and anguish and pain and loss. To have 25 million Sudanese in need of humanitarian aid, to have the deaths of tens and tens of thousands of people, the displacement of 10 million people, 2 million flowing over borders. Tom Perriell was with me in our delegation when we flew into Adre and met with some extraordinary local leaders in Chad who were still absorbing, frankly, people from the 2004-2005 crisis. And I have never sort of witnessed that sea of refugees, that scale of it. And I've been for the Syrian-Jordan border. I've been around this world, but to see the level of refugees that were coming over, close to 90% were women and children. At this point, we started seeing the impact of what is, if not officially declared famine, famine is coming. And the number of malnourished children is just scaling up in a struggling way. And then to talk to the individuals who were there from the World Food Program, from the United Nations, and to see their pain and anguish and sense of overwhelm, really pleading for attention to this crisis, knowing that the lack of response globally is one of the things that is allowing this kind of suffering at this scale to continue. And for me, and I think the others that were with us, I think it just shook us to our core to see and hear firsthand from people there. I will never forget women and children in the camps bringing me pictures of murdered men, to hearing about the stories of sexual violence and sexual assault, seeing that there is not only a need for food and medical care, but the psychological, socio-emotional needs now with the trauma that people have endured. And so coming back to the United States, where while there was celebrities talking about the Darfur crisis 2 decades ago, while there was social media talking about it, while there was attention on the nightly news to the crisis, to come back to what is the very opposite of love. It's not hate, it is indifference. It is a sheer lack of empathy and compassion and urgency to deal with this. I'm more motivated than ever to try to get more people to understand the nature of this crisis, the gravity of it, the sheer enormity of human suffering. And the last thing I'll say, and I'm so grateful that amidst all of this suffering, you see these lights of Sudanese people in civil society that are refusing to let despair have the last word, that they are willing to rise every single day and save lives and engage in the work of not giving up on the very idea that this nightmare can end, and in the meantime, do everything they can to address the suffering. We are defining the soul of our nation right now as Americans by how we are allowing, frankly, such a nightmarish reality to go undiscussed and unfocused on.
But Senator, to what do you ascribe that indifference? There's no shortage of high decibel interest in human rights issues and questions of humanitarian crisis in other places in the world at this very moment. Why is it that there seems to be an inability to understand and appreciate the depths of despair in the Sudan and to rally to it?
So I do not understand the psychology, the sort of collective psychology of our country right now, where we do have heart for the crisis in Gaza. We do have focus on the crisis in Ukraine, but somehow on our continent of Africa, crises in the DRC, crises in the Horn, and this crisis seem to go undiscussed and unnoticed, or get very little ink, if we can still say that, in terms of newspapers and major media. But that is not an excuse for us. And this is again where I began with CAP's willingness to focus on this, with extraordinary leaders that are doing the hard work. And I was very grateful that with all the things being discussed in the supplemental we just did, from Indochina and the crisis around Taiwan, from the Middle East to Europe, that we were able to, amidst it all, thanks to the leadership in the House and leadership in the Senate, to keep a significant investment in humanitarian aid to the tune of $9 billion. The challenge right now is getting that money obligated and out the door. We had a Paris conference that, again, I know Tom was, again, heroic in getting $2 billion committed. But right now, to me, the slowness of even that. So I do believe that one of the things we all should be taking responsibility for is telling the stories, elevating the voices of the Sudanese people, but in order to sustain the attention. Because even if the conflict stopped today, which it is not, and we should talk about what's necessary for that, the famine and the suffering and the struggle, and my concern, and the Congresswoman can speak to this, is it took so much to get this tranche of humanitarian aid done. But what about 25 and 26, when there'll still be a crisis? Will we have the collective will, which we won't unless there is collective pressure that comes from a nation that says this is unacceptable, and our humanity is wrapped up in the humanity and the suffering that is in Darfur. The definition of our character as a country will be reflected in what we do or don't do with the Sudanese people.
You've platformed those questions expertly for us, and so I'm going to draw Tom back in with some specificity on the level of aid, the volume of aid that's needed. But I'm going to ask you first, Tom, to address the point that's been made several times about the flow of munitions into Sudan, where they're coming from, and what you and others are attempting to do about that flow. And then I do want to speak about the Paris gathering some weeks ago, which insufficiently addressed the level of crisis that exists in Sudan. I want you to give us a sense of perspective on just the level of investment that's needed from the American people and from the international community. So arms first, and then humanitarian aid, and then Congresswoman, I'm going to turn to you, because I suspect that knowing Tom, he's going to speak to the imposition of sanctions and the need for more powerful sanctions. And I'm going to ask you to speak to the efficacy of our history of sanctions in the region and what the application needs to be going forward. Tom?
Thank you. In a way, I think that the question about arms dovetails with the humanitarian issue. When the senator and I were in Chad, what brought this to light to me in terms of the level of indifference wasn't just seeing these clearly famished children come across a border with bone-thin arms and glazed over eyes. It was that they then came to camps in Chad that the international community has full access to, and we're only getting 1.5 meals per day because we had not gotten enough aid into Chad. We are correctly lambasting the Sudanese army for blocking food and medicine from getting to needy people. it is an absolute violation of international humanitarian law of a shocking concern. But we don't have that excuse in Chad of why it is that we can't even have full rations for starving children when they cross the border. And I connect it to another thing, which is a question back to you of sorts, Ambassador, which is if you had told me in 2004 that in 2024, Ramaphosa would be president of South Africa, and he would greet the head of the Janjaweed on a plane paid for with Gulf money as someone who was actively involved in ethnic cleansing, and that there would not only be greeted, but no outrage in South African civil society from the majority or the opposition or civil society. This is in the West. Yes, it's about racism. It's about rendering Africa invisible, or the stories that get told. But we see that silence across Africa in a way that's hard to understand. We see it across the Gulf. And while Gaza has certainly taken a lot of that attention, this war started 6 months before Gaza. And there was still no attention on it. And the reason I connect that to the arms trade and the arms influx is we are seeing those weapons come in from all over, not equally. Clearly, the Emirati support to the RSF has been of a different scale than what we've seen. But now we're seeing the role of even more toxic actors like Iran, Houthis, Russia, et cetera, that are coming in ways the Sudanese people do not want to see. But to be honest, the United States is raising the costs of that through sanctions and other means, and I'm glad that we're doing that and we'll continue to ratchet it up. But it is in an environment in which the costs, the global costs, the consumer-based costs and diplomatic costs on those actors inside and outside who fueled this crisis have been fairly small. And it's the same issue that we have when it's why are we not able to get 3 meals a day to kids who are crossing over, who've walked hundreds of miles amidst tremendous trauma and are not getting even those 3 square meals. Now, I do think Paris, we did help to turn the tide. I think the number one credit goes to Sudanese civil society for raising voices month in and month out, and for the emergency rooms and others. I hope we'll get to hear about this incredible, courageous work of young people to completely reimagine how we deliver humanitarian aid in a crisis, and all of these great stories. But the truth is that the lack of international engagement has meant the tools we would normally use against both the armed factions and their suppliers have been rendered less effective than they would normally be when they are landing in an environment of silence. I think there are many levels and reasons we can go into with this. I think some of it too is frankly generational. My generation, the idea of atrocity prevention, human rights, never again was a core animating principle. I think today the issue of anti-imperialism is a more dominant strain among activists for very understandable reasons in many ways. But it frankly means when the US is not the bad guy, there's a lot less interest around the world. And while I understand that historically, given many events of recent decades, I think it misses the degree to which nefarious actions are being advanced by many other actors around the world now. And that rendering a blind eye to that is something that I think is going to cost a lot of lives and a lot of values. And I think this does come back to some other aspects of the war, but I just wanted to say on the experience that we had there is one other thing about the experience in the camps that I think is important for us all to understand, which is this war was less ethnically motivated than some of the previous conflicts originally, but it has taken on an increasingly ethnic and racial component. Hate crimes are rising, targeting clearly the ethnic cleansing of Masalit was already a major issue. And I bring that back to one of the most urgent things now, and I'll close with this, which is there are about 1 million civilians stuck right now in al-Fashir, and they are starving, and they are being starved by a siege by the RSF. But it's also true both sides need to allow humanitarian corridors. But given the slaughter of civilians escaping Jina in earlier parts, many feel like their choices are to stay and starve or to leave and risk ethnic cleansing and abuse. That is the choice that we have left the people in al-Fashir with. Now, we are obviously working day and night to get solutions, including a ceasefire in al-Fashir and humanitarian corridors, and many courageous Sudanese are leading those efforts, and we are working on them. But that's the degree that we have left people with choices in Darfur through the indifference and through these other frames. And with that, I'll send back.
Tom, I'm going to the Congresswoman now on this question of sanctions that you briefly touched on, and I'm sure that the senator may have a word or two that he'd like to add to that. Then I'm going to ask you, Haitham, to really describe the efforts that Tom intimated that are being led by courageous young people in the country, civil society leaders in the country, to actually get humanitarian aid to ground in the Sudan right now in the midst of conflict. But Tom, before I leave you, can you just give our audience some specific understanding of the level of aid that's required now, what you were able to accomplish in Paris, and what the gap is and how we fill it?
So first of all, credit for Paris goes to a lot of people, including our French colleagues. I don't necessarily say that often in front of you, Patrick, but again, it was the initiative of the Sudanese people. It was the anniversary. It was starting from a standpoint where the needs that had been identified for this year had only 4% had been met, not 4-0, but 4% of the need had been met before Paris. That was able to get up to about 50% of the pledge. Obviously now, one, we have to make sure that those pledges become actual checks. You and I know that doesn't always happen. Two, we have to make sure that food and medicine is getting to the places it needs to be, including continuing to work the access issues. And the supplemental passage was a major, major step for this. The U.S. has clearly led. We've spent over $1 billion since the war began on humanitarian aid. We also need to be reimagining aid. It is the innovations that are out there are still hard to scale. So ultimately, there is no way to circumvent completely the traditional way of getting big trucks in and to the places that we need them, but also these issues of the cash apps and local kitchens that Sudanese youth have created. We need to figure out ways to scale up those efforts. And we need to be ready for things to get worse. We need a breakthrough, but the rainy season is starting any day. We have a country that already has bad infrastructure that's going to worse. If we see El Fasher fall, we could see up to 1 million additional refugees flooding into probably Chad. We have flooding in South Sudan. So this is a situation where people need to understand Paris was the start of scaling up. It cannot be we just did that, so we took care of Sudan. So we need to continue, as our USAID colleagues and NGO colleagues are doing, and working with our local partners. But we are a long, long way from addressing the need.
Thank you so much, Tom. Congresswoman, so some of us are old enough to remember when the U.S. imposed sanctions in Sudan in 1993, in 1997, in 2006. We just imposed targeted sanctions on the defense industries in Sudan. I'm wondering about the efficacy of all of this and what the appetite continues to be on Capitol Hill to maybe go a step further. Representative Jacobs, for instance, just introduced a bill calling for the withdrawal of arms support to the UAE until the UAE can make absolute claim to the U.S. that those weapons are not being transferred to warring parties in the Sudan. I wonder how you think about the efficacy of our sanctions and specifically about this bill from Representative Jacobs. I should also know that in addition to UAE, Egypt is also an actor in this, causing a tremendous amount of harm on the ground.
Yeah, I'm a co-sponsor of that bill. And I believe it's really important to think about all of the tools that we have, because traditionally, often sanctions end up hurting the people at the bottom, but not the people at the top. And so we have to be really thoughtful about what leverage do we have. And the bill from Representative Jacobs says we will use our own leverage providing military assistance. So in other words, we won't provide military assistance to the UAE until they can show us clearly that they are not funding the RSF. And so I think this is one tool that we have. But I want to go back to something that the senator said, because I think this is really important. You know, it was very difficult for us to get $9 billion of humanitarian assistance out of Congress. And I think this goes back to the United States has never actually, our people have never necessarily seen the fate of the United States tied to the rest of the world. I grew up in other parts of the world. I've worked in refugee camps all across Asia and Africa. I've worked with immigrants and refugees from around the world. And it's always been a struggle to make the clear case of why the United States should be involved. And it gets harder if it's a Maslow's hierarchy of needs. It gets harder if people here are struggling, then it becomes a competition of where the resources go. And you've seen this in Congress over and over again, or even if you ask the average American, how much do we spend on international aid? They will say 20%. And often I'll start the question by saying, we will spend whatever you think we are spending, because I'd like them to say 20% so that I can get 20%, which never, of course, will never happen. So I think that there is a level of narrative and education that we need to do. Now, add to that the African subcontinent, which I just think has been, for reasons of race, for reasons of historic indifference, based on a number of different factors, has been ignored in numerous ways. And so Sudan, in a way, is, we're seeing all of it come together. And if we're going to make a difference, there are really three things in my mind that have to happen. Number one, on humanitarian assistance, we are too little and too late. Our systems do not allow for the kind of level of humanitarian assistance that we need in these crises, which is why the ERRs are so important, because that is coming from within. But there is work that we have to do to protect those ERRs. The young people who are within those ERRs need to be given the status of humanitarian workers, and we need to make sure that we are funneling as much aid as possible through those and getting rid of the bureaucratic obstacles that are standing in the way of getting there. Number two, we have to use all the tools to actually address the outside players that are really in Sudan right now as their playground for a number of their own purposes, but not for peace in the region. And that is the UAE, that is Egypt. These are actors that we have relationships with. They care about what the American people think. And there is a real power to, both in Congress using legislation and leverage and tools, whether it's some form of sanctions or whether it's some form of withholding of military assistance, but also, number three, the voice of the people. Many of these countries do not want the American people to be protesting their countries. Their public image is very important to them. And I think it is important for us to think about public engagement in two ways. One, how do we really raise the information and the education about what's happening in Sudan? I think the vast majority of Americans, if you ask them, they wouldn't know where Sudan is. They wouldn't know how many people live there. They wouldn't know how many people are displaced. And a lot of the work that we have to do is, sadly, to educate people about what is happening. But also, there is a real ability to create a movement here for peace and justice, to connect this conflict to others, but also to elevate the call for outside actors to stay out and stop funding this war. I don't think it would continue this long without that funding. I know it wouldn't. But also then to engage the diaspora and the Sudanese people and Sudanese civil society in putting forward their vision and making sure that that holds in the peace talks that Tom is engaged with. So it's a big order, and I'm grateful to CAP for kicking this off. I will say that I'm working with a number of Sudanese activists, Sudanese American activists. Really how I got pulled into the Sudan issue was a dear friend of mine who's probably watching the live stream right now, who was the chair of the board of the Immigrant and Refugee Rights Organization that I started, who is from Sudan, who just managed to get his family, his parents, out of Sudan. They've lost their home, they've lost everything. They've lost their fields. His father didn't want to leave because it was planting season and he wanted to be there for the crops, but they've lost that house now. It's gone. It's been occupied. His sisters were not able to come to the United States, so they're in Egypt and Oman, I think. And I think this is, the level of devastation is so tremendous that even people in refugee camps we're not getting what they need of humanitarian assistance. I think it has been a very, very challenging moment, but also a time to call people into action, to call the Sudanese civil society into action. Not that they weren't there all along, but they want us to be there. They don't want to be there without us. We have to bring the American people along as well. And so Mubarak and others are coordinating a series of town halls, virtual town halls, with organizations like Move On and others, but also with Sudanese and Sudanese affiliated diaspora people around the world to get their input and to make sure that their voices are a part of this process.
I'm reminded by that comprehensive and humane response that you did spend 2 decades working in international relief and issues, and I think we need to elect a few more people who have that background. I promised you, Haitham, that I was going to come to you and ask you to describe what Tom opened us, made us aware of, the work that's happening on the ground now by the diaspora, by civil society in Sudan to get relief directly into communities. I wonder if you might describe some of that and help our audience understand what more we could be doing right now in the first instance to support those ongoing efforts in a specific way. I'm going to preview a question that I have for the senator. We have to open up the conversation to the audience and to journalists who are here and online. But Senator, after I get a response to this question, I'm gonna put a little bit of pressure on you. Tom tried to put the pressure on me by mentioning the example of Cyril Ramaphosa and the reprehensible hosting of the leader of the Janjaweed some months ago. But you know, Tom, to be honest, there are so many places around the world, including the country that I had the privilege of serving in, that are learning from the U.S. example about what it means to be focused narrowly on your national self-interest, however you may define those security interests and those economic interests. And they would point to our example and say that we have not always been consistent on these issues. So, Senator, President Biden, when he ran for office and subsequently when he's been elected to the Oval Office, he said that he wanted to lead a United States that was known in the world for the power of its example and not the example of its power. So specifically, after I get your response, specifically, I want you to articulate what you think that ought to mean in this instance in the Sudan, when this country is being absolutely ravaged. And as you yourself said, we have not maintained our gaze on rights and justice in an unstinting way there. So first, give us a sense of how we're getting relief to the ground and what more our audience can specifically do to help those efforts.
Right. Thank you. So first, I just wanted to get to the point that Special Envoy mentioned and Senator also mentioned. And it's specifically, for example, for me, when I turn on the TV and I see all the major news media, that the broadcasting is always streaming from Ukraine all the way to Gaza and Israel. And for the past 14 months, I can literally count the time that it mentioned Sudan. It just bothered me, and it just that it shows a trend, it shows a pattern of just, you know, Africa is not in interest of the U.S. and that should not be the case if we're talking about leading by example, and if just referring to that. The second thing is Sudan is a young country, and it's the majority of the population is youth, and youth always showed us that they deliver. We always ask for revolution. We want things to be nonviolent. We want things to be peaceful. And the youth, as the Congresswoman talked about, showed that and delivered. So I think it required us to recognize this is their future. Youth are the core of everything related to Sudan. And one of the things is also that I wanted to talk about when it comes to the term of humanitarian assistance, and specifically when the Special Envoy mentioned Paris conference. That's the main problem is we see that the discrepancy between what's promised and what's provided. That we hear $2 billion, and now we don't see that on the ground. People on the ground, they don't see that. That's not the case. It's ERR are working under extremes, the lack of any government, any shape or form of institution, and they do that by being creative. They do that by through the experience that they gain from mobilization and organization through the past 5 years, toppling the al-Bashir regime. And I think it's past due to recognize them as the leading bodies to move Sudan forward for sustainable peace. And that's being said, I think it's worth. One of the problem also is just that we see the bureaucratic machines that need to exercise flexibility. We always see that a lot of what they ask is that sees that the flexibility. This is a war. This is not something that's scripted. It says like when something like this happen, you have to do this. You have to be creative. So the main thing is creativity. Creativity, it just gives the ERR and the leverage to do the work, to help people, to deliver aids, to evacuate people and everything in between. So basically it's how we can empower youth, how we can support ERR in a way that they can do the work that the whole world now is just hand off and just looking at, the ERR, that's what they're doing. And then at the end of the day, claiming that, we're supporting ERR, which is true. I'm not trying to blame anybody, but it's just we need to scale up what's already that the modality that the ERR established. They already established modality. They already serve their community. They already know exactly how their community operate, and they earn the trust of their community from being always. They earn the trust. They earn the respect because they always answer to their community. They always help their community. So it's the solutions come from the community. It's a bottom-up solution. And that's the common denominator, and the heart of that is youth, is ERR, and local initiative. Not to forget that there's a lot of other local initiative that's operating, but it's how can we scale up? How can we bridge the gap in the discrepancy between what's promised and what's delivered?
So that's a terribly important point, and I think it ladders up perfectly to what I think will be included in the response from the senator. Senator, some of us have had experiences on the ground in too many places where you have a conflict like this, and the international community, the U.S., the UN, other actors come in and organize the peace between warring parties that leads, of course, to enshrining those warring parties into governance into the future, and excludes civil society and democratic actors on the ground. So if you think about my initial question to you about the power of our example and what may be possible here to stop the conflict, I want you, if you could, to kind of bring this notion in as well about who we see as the legitimate negotiating partners that we're investing in for the future. Tom, Congresswoman, I'm sure that when we open this up, there'll be opportunities for you to weigh in with other solutions.
So I give a lot of credit to Tom and the time we spent together on multiple planes for emphasizing this point over and over in his work with me, that the Sudanese people, especially these civil society groups who have not been at the table, that we use our power and our influence to make sure that the Sudanese civil society groups, youth groups, that they have a voice, that they're at the table, that they're elevated amidst this crisis, because there is no true solution. There may be a ceasefire or a stalemate, but the real solution, the real democratic solution, lies with the Sudanese people and making sure they're at the table, period. I want to pull back just for a second, because I think this is a bigger contextual point. And I made it at the beginning by saying the future of Africa is the future of humanity. And we know this already because there's great power competitions going on the continent, just for the sheer critical mineral resources, strategic location. A lot is going on, from the Wagner Group to the Chinese to you name it. I do not want to downplay ever the presence that America has on the continent. Every country I go to, we are praised for our work, whether it's PEPFAR and the extraordinary impact it's made, whether it's AGOA and the investments we're making in building local economies and expanding it. We have been present on the continent doing very good things. I am simply saying the investment we're making, the return on that investment is so great, we should be doubling down and tripling down on that investment, because our destiny in the next 50 years is so interwoven with the African destiny. And the crisis we're responding to right now, we will see more crises because, as Tom said, this is not a natural disaster. But let's be clear, the Sahel region is growing because of climate change. The fisheries that are being exploited around the Horn by overfishing, by the climate change as well, is going to cause more instability, cause more global migration, cause more conflict. If we invest before these crises become, dollars invested now in stability, dollars invested in civil society, in youth, in democracy, will bear a harvest for not just our country, but for stability, for growth, for peace and strength on the African continent. Because at the end of the day, when I talk to African leaders and African civil society, they don't want to deal with the Wagner Group. They don't want to deal with the Chinese. They believe in our values. We have a shared sense of values and morals. And this is an opportunity for America. So let's focus on the sheer humanitarian urgency of this moment, but not forget the long view and the power that we show by investing in civil society groups, making sure they're at the table, part of the solution, and that not just, as Martin Luther King taught us, peace is not just the absence of violence, it's the presence of justice. And that's why we have to invest in the justice of making sure that the Sudanese people are actually leading in a democratic fashion.
Senator, I knew that I could count on you to close out the first portion of this with some moral clarity and spiritual ballast, and you did exactly that. So I want to open this up for questions. I think that we're starting with an online question from a journalist first. Is that right, William?
Yes, I believe we're going to start with a question from Reuters, Allison.
From Reuters?
Yeah, we have a question from Nafisa El Tahir from Reuters. Two questions, actually. The first is that last week, the Sudanese Armed Forces said it had an agreement pending for a Russian fuel station in the Red Sea. Is this ringing any alarm bells in Washington, and will there be any new steps taken in response? The second question is about UAE support. To what extent does the U.S. believe the UAE is directly behind the attack on al-Fashir, whether in terms of material support or strategy?
Our special envoy, I don't know if you want to take the first question and maybe invite the senator and congresswoman into the second question.
Sure. I also need to apologize. I was just informed that I'm still visible even when I'm not talking. So I've been eating an apple and some other distracting things, not realizing.
You're allowed to eat between your frenetic negotiations, Tom.
So I am sorry. The answer to the first question is yes. I think on the one hand, we've seen this movie many times before of flirtations between Russia and the army in Sudan. On the other hand, these are not normal times. So the question of whether this is more like previous dalliances or headed towards a more serious commitment. We've had some of the hardliners within SAF, some of those that are most, I think, hated by the Sudanese people, kind of chest thumping about Russia as well. So it is something that speaks to this. I also think, honestly, it speaks to why it is that the army needs to understand the strategic value of going to negotiations. I think its options, frankly, are getting worse for military solutions to the conflict. I think almost every credible actor has looked at this and said that there is not a path to a military solution. And we really need them to be engaging in a serious way in the negotiations that can end this war. And I believe there is a path to peace. And I don't even think it's that long of a path, but it does require the political will from those actors. So I think that issue is something that is likely to further destabilize the region. And therefore, I think is something that's not landing well with even some of the governments that have been relatively supportive of SAF and the army. But again, what we see right now more generally, and several people spoke to this, is that Sudan right now is extremely fragile. And that means that there's a growing number of actors who want to take advantage of the suffering of the Sudanese people to try to advance their own interests. And I think that's something the Sudanese people will look very poorly on right now and in the future. And I think it goes to why we need the urgency of finding a peace, first and foremost, because of the humanitarian suffering that is only getting worse as we head into the rainy season, but also because the number of bad actors that could be coming into this and taking advantage of the Sudanese people is only increasing. So I can speak to the second, but why don't we go to the senator and congresswoman on that? And I will just say something that we don't often have, which is while this happens to be two Democrats, two wonderful Democrats in this, Sudan is an issue that has enjoyed extremely strong bipartisan support in both the House and the Senate. You've certainly seen Senator Risch and Chairman James and others be great allies in this, including holding the administration's feet to the fire, but most importantly, in shining that light on Sudan. And so I do think that's something that relates to the second answer, which is that there has been bipartisan concern raised about the Emirati role as well as other foreign actors. And they do have certain tools beyond the administration's tools to raise the cost of those interventions. And I think that's been noticed very much across the region. So with that, I'll throw it back to you and try not to eat my apple.
Like with the apple, I think he got to the core of the matter.
That was so corny,
I'm sorry. I hope you found that appealing. You can go ahead and go to the next question. Yeah.
Good deal. Microphone's coming around. We have questions on both sides.
Thank you. Kemi Oshikoya from the Africa Bazaar magazine. So my question is, you talk about the investment that the US government have been making in Africa, including the humanitarian assistance. What role can the private sector play? What role can the private sector play in bringing peace, stability, and economic empowerment? Because I think that's a key issue here that we're not talking about. And we've seen what Ambassador Meg Whitman have done in Kenya. I know Kenya is now in crisis, but the power of the private sector, like companies like IBM and other multinational company, what they can do in Africa. If you can talk about that, thank you.
Let's take up that question. And as we take this question, I want to remind everybody that right now, 90% of the gold being produced in Sudan is basically being fleeced and exploited to the benefit of both warring parties.
I mean, I'll jump right in, just give some quick numbers. We were Africa's #1 trading partner until about 2009. China's now passed us. They're now 4 times the amount of trade than the United States does. And again, they do it on their terms, which are very different than our terms. We have a tremendous opportunity that we should be promoting. I'm very proud that the Biden administration is trying to do more to celebrate and to activate American investment where we can have shared growth. I've been to the continent, twice around March. And when I was in Kenya, I saw with my own eyes what American investment and partnership with Africans can create. We saw one company that focused on a DEET replacement. DEET is this toxic chemical we all spray on ourselves. Well, they found a flower in Kenya native to the community that has a better agricultural cycle than a lot of the agricultural foods. Their company, just by working on a process to turn this into mosquito repellent, was able to source hundreds and hundreds of farmers. I saw before and after pictures of these farmers going from subsistence farming to thriving, increasing their net worth dramatically, and really created wealth for a whole region in Kenya. It's an extraordinary example of one company transforming the destinies and creating wealth and value. These are the kind of things that we can be doing. I've sat with embassy officials and State Department officials with programs we're doing to support indigenous African entrepreneurs. I can go on and on and on about this work that we're doing. My goal in partnership with great allies in the House is to celebrate and bring attention to the success stories we have, but use that as a leverage to increase dramatically that kind of investment so that we can start upping our power, because trade and investment, that is the real stability that comes that is offered to African nations. Now, I'll give the example of Ireland, which had terrorist problems and challenges. Their shared economic growth in that country really helped to bring stability, end violence, and offer new frontiers. We're seeing that in nascent stages all around the continent, but I do believe we have to do much, much more.
One other thing for countries that are in crisis, where I've really seen the private sector make a difference, is in the communications network. Because as you know, the communications network is one of the first things to go. It's very difficult to get it going again. And it's an essential, whether you're talking about Egypt or whether you're talking about Sudan, it's an essential piece of making sure people can communicate and be able to organize on the ground, communicate with the outside world, with the press. And so that is one area where I think I know I'm from the state of Washington. So I have a lot of tech engineers in my district and in my state. And the friend that I mentioned actually worked at Microsoft for 20 years. And so I do think that there are some crisis moment private sector assistance. It's less in the name of investment and trade per se, because we're in this moment of crisis, but real ways that that the private sector can help to establish those very essential communications networks.
And can I just say one more point, because it was made to me by a lot of the Kenyan officials who were just here at the state dinner, which is just America should use its power also to get access to capital at lower interest rates. One of the problems we see in a lot of African countries is just getting deep into debt because the interest rates they pay are so dramatically higher than a lot of Western nations, and for unfair reasons. So in the capital markets, our country has to do a lot more in advocacy and fighting for African countries who are trying to do a lot of their own infrastructure investment, their own capital investment in domestic industries.
I'm not going to let you get two for the price of one, because we have many hands up and not much time. So sorry. I'm going to let you when we get the next question.
Thank you, Mr. Special Envoy. Talking to Sudanese people, looking at the Sudanese people, by majority, they are hoping every day and night for this war to get stopped. And the hope is Jeddah talked. And we know that you have been lately working hardly to get the two parties to go to Jeddah. Really, these people are looking for any update on Jeddah talk. Have you extended invitation to the two parties? Have you listened from them? Is there any hope that Jeddah talk is going to be happen very soon? If you can give some information about that, that will be appreciated. Senator Booker and Congresswoman Jayapal and Haytham, what do you think that the Sudanese diaspora and the legislators here inside the United States of America for the short term could do to help the effort of the special envoy and to have this party go back to the negotiation?
We'll get a succinct response from our special envoy, and then I'll come to you, Haytham, on the question of diaspora.
Oh, I don't know that there's a succinct response to the question of how's Jeddah going. But it is our top priority. And I do believe we have built substantial momentum, not just to Jeddah specifically, but to what it represents, which is a strategy of trying to end the war and hand over to a political civilian process. And our theory has been that it's going to be very difficult to get the two generals to agree on their own. So what is the set of actors who have enough political will in the region that if they are partners in peace, we can compel a peace deal. So far, everyone is committed to the peace talks that includes the Egyptians, the Emiratis, the Saudis, the African Union and IGAD, and also the RSF. And SAF has so far put conditions and frankly, some very mixed signals at different points. We are working hard to get them committed to the talks as soon as possible. But again, not just to the talks, but to a deal that ends the war in an enforceable way. We are planning for alternatives if Jeddah doesn't work, but I think the general consensus has been this is our best collection of the right actors, including many who are not part of Jeddah, but are helping to raise the political cost of those that are fueling the war inside and outside. And I think convincing all of the actors that there really is no path forward. It's a path to a war of attrition and a more an increasingly fractured and ethnicized war. So I wanted Jeddah talks yesterday. I wanted them 3 months ago, 2 months ago. We are disappointed. I'm not going to hide that. We are frustrated. We need our hosts to feel a lot more urgency. I will say, and not just because I happen to be in Cairo right now, the Egyptians have actually been incredibly constructive in wanting peace and feeling the same sense of urgency. While they have publicly talked about their support for SAF, there's no mystery of that. They consider their commitment to peace and the Sudanese people. Obviously, they share a border, which I think gives them a greater sense of urgency. They, along with Kenyans and other African partners, have really been helping in the last few months to change the sense of the just complete unacceptability of this war continuing. The African Union high-level panel, I think, who I will meet with tomorrow in Addis, has also, I think, been very constructive in creating a strong center of gravity within that institution. But we need more partners that are willing to raise the costs of those who are creating headaches, and dealing with the SAF as its own, unique experience. So we are absolutely engaged in this. That doesn't mean we aren't trying to get some localized ceasefires in El Fasher and other places. We're going to walk and chew gum because we have to. We're looking at every option we can. But we do, last thing I think I'll say about Jeddah is, while I know people have been concerned about the various different forums and forum shopping, I actually think that's a good sign that there are more and more countries that want to be contributing to a peace process. I think we need those to each be tributaries feeding into a single river that then becomes strong enough to carry Sudan to a peaceful place. So we will not rest until we have not just talks, but a deal. We share the frustration that it hasn't happened yet, but we do believe sometimes on an hourly basis that we're within reach of that breakthrough, and other hours we don't. So I appreciate the question and all of the efforts to help get this breakthrough that we need.
Thank you, Tom. So let's speak briefly to how the diaspora is supporting Tom's work and all the ongoing negotiations.
This is why we're here. Part of it is we're being here. We've been visible, and we are using the power of our vote to ask our elected officials to bring light to Sudan issue, and we will continue to look for all the venues that to make our voice heard. We have all our colleagues from different international community organization, from Amnesty International to Human Rights Watch to Humanitarian United, along with just people like Samah, Lokman, Dr. Nasruddin, and Ismail on the audience here, to make our voice heard and to mobilize the community that say, hey, you have the power of the vote. That's how you bring change. That's how you make your elected official answer to your concerns.
Perfect. And I'll also add quickly to that we've had a number of prominent Sudanese American business leaders who are also engaged in supporting this work, to go back to the question of the role of the private sector. So let's do this. I'm fearful that we're about to lose our senator and our Congress member to votes on Capitol Hill. Can we just quickly group together 3 last questions that are expressed as succinctly as possible?
We're actually going to take our last question, if that's okay, from Mohammed Osman, who is going to join us online on camera. Just a second.
Mohammed, can you hear us?
I can hear you clearly, see you clearly. Can you hear me and see me?
Absolutely.
Thanks very much, and thanks for the rich conversation and also the opportunity to address the final question to the panel. We've heard a lot about the 2 warring parties and regional partners and their specific interests. We've also heard about the necessity of elevating Sudanese civil society and civilian actors as the key stakeholders in building and sustaining peace. The old regime haven't gone away. What's the plan for engagement with them? and making the cost of continued spoiling and conflict for them greater than a continuation of this conflict? Thanks.
Yeah, that's it.
Special Envoy Perriello.
Oh, I thought we were grouping 3 questions together.
We're
No, Tom, the great ambassador was overruled by a beautiful bald man.
So if the question is, yeah, so where are we? Is the question Mohammed's question about how to engage the former regime, or are we going somewhere else?
No, that's where we are, Tom.
Yeah. So
That apple had some interesting effects here.
Yes. So this dovetails a bit with the question I was just reading online by Allah, which is that there's, when we talk about what caused the war, there's no shortage of underlying and pre-existing issues that are there, whether it's the racial and caste system, center versus peripheries, whether it's the failure to have a monopoly on violence/force of a single military. And certainly this issue about the existence of the former regime and what form that takes coming back is a really important one. The short answer, that's also the right answer, is it should be up to the Sudanese people to decide and not those of us on the outside. But obviously, we are engaged and involved, and so trying to figure out how and when to do so is an open question. Generally speaking, in the Sudanese that I meet with, both in the diaspora, in the neighboring countries and refugee camps, but we also meet with hundreds and hundreds inside using technology. There is very little appetite or desire to see either former regime officials re-engaged and certainly given power, or Islamic extremists, again, using this as a backdoor to power. It does occasionally come up in more pragmatic questions of how do you avoid them being spoilers to a peace process or spoilers going forward. And because of the urgency of peace, I think, those are fair questions to ask. Generally speaking, right now, I do not think that is something that increases the chances of peace. I think it actually is increasing the factionalization, particularly within SAF. And I think what we're seeing in the sort of inclusive political dialogue process is that the definition of trying to make it more inclusive shouldn't be the first instinct of some is to go to the least legitimate, most disgraced actors versus, hey, what about all these people that were not invited into the process in the first place? So it's a good question, and it's got some pragmatic qualities to it in terms of how people should be engaged going forward. I also think there's a difference between handing certain people actual power in a power sharing arrangement versus a longer term question, should they be allowed in a political process going forward? So I think the first is the default that we've heard from the Sudanese people is not wanting to see a return, at least to power and influence of these actors. There's an awareness that to the extent we need to avoid spoilers to the process, there's some engagement. And just like the term Islamist in Sudan, it just can mean so many different things. Is it a short, is it an ideological issue? Is it shorthand for hardliner or authoritarian? Is it about connection to foreign actors? So I think I'm going to go way beyond a succinct answer here, except to say, understand the question. It's an important one. Our starting point is to try to protect the process as much as possible for those who have not had voice and make sure they are empowered.
Tom, we couldn't have a better leader in place on this issue. Godspeed in Cairo. Haitham, thank you so very much for your ongoing leadership in the diaspora. Senator, thank you for being our bulwark on Capitol Hill. I'm going to leave it to Representative Jayapal to close this out, give us a summation and a charge going forward.
Well, thank you so much, Patrick. Thank you, Tom. Thank you to this incredible group of experts here on stage, my colleagues, but most of all, thank you to all of you. I think today is not the day of the forgotten war. This is the day of seeing this war. This is the day of lifting up the people of Sudan and the work of the international community to come together and to demand a different outcome, to demand a different future. I'm always, as an organizer, longtime organizer, 20 years before coming to Congress, I always think about the fact that the work is such that strength emerges in times of crisis. That's what I saw in Sudan in 2019 and 2020. That's what I see today. And as Dr. King said, the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. I always say it's your hands, our hands, that get put on that moral arc of the universe and bend it more quickly towards justice. So we will play with Senator Booker's incredible leadership in Congress. We will play the role that we can play in Congress to make sure that we are lifting up the need for humanitarian assistance, that we are lifting up the need to hold all the partners accountable, both within Sudan, but also outside, but also using our platforms to bring attention to this issue. And with our partners in civil society, Sudanese civil society, I think that is really where the hope lies, with the young people, with the new models, with the creativity, with the inspiration that that we are seeing continuing to emerge in what is very, very difficult times, and always with the grace and the beauty of poetry. Thank you so much.